This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Cool, well, thank you everyone for coming to the final early career seminar in the history of political ideas for this term. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Tom Cutterham, who gained his DPhil from Oxford earlier this year and is currently the Christopher Cox Fellow at New College, Oxford. His dissertation was on Gentlemen Revolutionaries, Power and Justice in the New American Republic, 1781 to 1787. And his paper today will be titled Political Thought and Class Formation in the New American Republic.
Thanks very much. Thanks all of you for coming. I got basically all of the standard disclaimers before a seminar paper, which is that this is very sketchy and it's kind of formed out of some of the ideas and sources from my thesis, but spun in a slightly different direction that I'm trying to think about some of these things in relation to putting a postscript or final chapter on my book project that comes out of the thesis, having to do with developing the stuff that I've done about 1780s thought into the future of the new republic, into the 19th century. But that's not something I know great loads about, so you'll see how sketchy it is in this paper. And the other disclaimer is that I'm not sure if I am a historian of political thought, let alone political ideas, whatever that is. So methodologically, you might have some quibbles, and I would be very grateful to hear from them. I think probably the thing that will likely to be producing the most interesting discussion will be your thoughts on what the relationship is between political thought and class formation. That's what I'm trying to explore in the context of America, but I'm really hoping to get thoughts and maybe reading on theoretically and methodologically on how you can do those things. So, okay, political thought and class formation in the new American Republic. Within months of the destruction of the East India Company's tea in Boston Harbor on the 16th of December 1773, the New Jersey landowner and future author of the Federal Constitution's famous opening words, "We the People," warned his colony's proprietor Thomas Paine that the imperial crisis in America would soon develop into a struggle between classes. "The mob begin to think and to reason," wrote Morris. "Poor reptiles. It is with them a vernal morning. They are struggling to cast off their winter's sloth. They bask in the sunshine, and ere noon they will bite, depend upon it. The gentry begin to fear this." End quote. Morris predicted that the gentry, in their attempts to organise and control provincial politics, quote, "will deceive the people and again forfeit a share of their confidence. And if these instances of what with one side is policy, with the other perfidy, shall continue to increase and become more frequent, farewell aristocracy." Morris painted the colonial social structure as one bifurcated between the people and an aristocracy that depended on the supine obedience of those it ruled. The destabilizing effect of the showdown between empire and colonies would throw this delicate arrangement into disarray. It had already begun. If the tumult continued, Morris concluded, quote, "we shall be under the domination of a riotous mob." Generations of historians have observed the existence of class struggle, often openly understood in the language of people and aristocracy, mob and moneyed men, throughout the era of the American Revolution. Just as many have concluded that by some point in the early 19th century, if not earlier, American society was remarkably free of such struggle, and of antagonistic class consciousness altogether. The early American Republic was divided by deep inequalities of race and gender, but by comparison with Europe, it was a classless society. Or to put it only slightly differently, it was a middle-class society in which a vast majority of white Americans could join in the same identity, the same values, and the same political language. For some historians, this is a story of triumph. It has often been invoked to help account for what they regard as the historically and morally exceptional role of the United States in the world. It is a story of we the people's victory over not just the British Empire, but a nascent national aristocracy as well, a story of the natural progress of liberty. For other historians, of course, it is a historical problem that demands explanation. This paper tries to bring the story of class formation in the new American Republic into contact with the development of political thought in the same period. It asks how it was that the political language and ideology through which Americans understood the world, a language of aristocracy, mobs, virtue, gentility, and licentiousness, sufficiently transformed in the last quarter of the 18th century to yield a middle-class consensus that seemed to occur nowhere else, and was assuredly contingent rather than preordained. how was political thought channeled in a direction that produced 19th century American ideology? The answer I'll present here hinges on the role of the very national elite that was supposed to have been defeated. This paper focuses on a smaller scale process of class formation and a tighter time frame, one that took place amongst American elites in the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Through the political contests and the political writing of the 1780s, a short-lived national ruling class emerged and coalesced around a relatively coherent set of strategies and values. It was the choices they made and the language they developed that significantly established the terms of future American political thought and class identity. And now I'm going to skip over a couple of pages of historiographical stuff that I had in the original paper, but which, due to pressures of time, I'm not going to give you, and just go straight to the rest of the paper. So Americans did not become objectively more equal and less class-bound in the early 19th century. While the land expropriated from Native Americans and bought from Napoleon's France made it possible for many Americans to avoid proletarianization, it did not prevent a gradual rise in inequality as the capitalist economy took off. As always, that inequality was geographically uneven. It was concentrated in cities and in the East. By contrast, historians ever since Frederick Jackson Turner have pointed to the frontier as the cradle of American egalitarianism. Yet frontier economies were also structured by deep asymmetries of power between the men and women who settled there on the one hand and those who profited from land sales, mortgages, and control of commerce on the other. In the South, of course, the prevalence of slavery racialized the division between labor and capital, but it also deepened inequality between white men by raising the cost barriers to economic independence. In terms of their objective relation to capital, Americans in the 19th century were no less divided by class than they had been in the late 18th. What had changed was their consciousness. As Gareth Stedman Jones argued a generation ago, class as a historical process has always been mediated by language and culture, by the means of understanding and communicating shared positions and shared struggle. Class consciousness arises from inherent conflicts of interest under the regimes of capital, but it can never do so without the cognitive apparatus that gives those struggles form in the minds of their participants. It is here that class formation meets the history of political thought, at the point where linguistic and conceptual structures shape and limit the possibilities of consciousness, intent, and action. It matters what people thought and the language they thought in, who they thought was on their side and who was against them, what problems they wanted to solve, and what they thought could be done, and what would make their actions just. So it follows that the turbulence in American political thought during the Revolutionary era, the flexibility and creativity that historians have attributed to the period, might also have applied to the problem of class. It follows that we might find, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, a remaking of identity and consciousness, framed not just around nationhood, empire, and union, but around social order and division. A remaking of American class. In fact, the reordering of political boundaries, the creation of union and empire out of a group of peripheral provinces, could not have been achieved without a social transformation. The project of an American nation, like all national and post-colonial projects, depended on the construction of a new national elite. The political structures necessary to pursue the war with Britain, Continental Congress and its fiscal military powers, its ambassadors, financiers and army officers, laid a foundation of a cadre that began to leave provincial identity behind in favour of what they sometimes called the continental view with a capital C. This cadre was by no means the cream of provincial elites. The revolution had placed much of the uppermost order of society, in opposition to the patriot cause, creating a leadership vacuum eagerly filled by merchants, politicians, lawyers and planters, many of whom claimed no great social distinction in the pre-revolutionary era. This was a small, fragile group of parvenus who would much later be glorified as America's founding fathers. But even as the war came to a victorious conclusion, their struggle to assure the unity of that new country reflected the problem of forming a unity amongst themselves. Their fears of weakness and collapse for the United States were, in part, the expression of anxiety about their future as a ruling class. Take, for example, the debate over the Society of the Cincinnati. In the late summer and autumn of 1782, with the peace commissioners nearing agreement in Paris, a group of Washington's senior officers led by Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller and general of artillery, formed an organization intended to maintain the existence of the officer corps after the army was inevitably disbanded. Its founding charter declared the intention to, quote, perpetuate both the remembrance of the war and, quote, the mutual friendships which had been formed under the pressure of common danger and in many instances cemented by the blood of the parties. It would furthermore promote the union between the states, quote, national honor, and, quote, the future dignity of the American empire. It was to be composed of any officer who had served 3 years in the army or was still serving at the moment of demobilisation, and membership was to pass down by primogeniture in perpetuity. Taking its name from the Roman general who had left his plough to defend the Republic as dictator, then given up his power when the danger had passed, the society styled itself as a means for continued participation of the officer corps in the public life of the new nation. Within months, it was the subject of spiralling controversy. Alongside criticism of the military character of the society, which played into the fear of standing armies that was an important element in Republican Whig politics, the point most strongly at issue was the question of heredity. A pamphlet printed first in Charleston and then in Philadelphia, and quickly circulated throughout the states, alleged that it would be only a few generations before the Cincinnati had developed into a noble order dominating the United States. By distinguishing themselves with badges and sashes, holding annual meetings and corresponding between state branches, by exerting an influence on public affairs, raising funds for their collective use, and most of all by passing on their privileged status to their heirs by blood, the officers were laying the foundations of an aristocracy. The outcry came from some of the most senior members of the national elite, from congressmen, diplomats, and judges, as well as from state legislatures like that of Massachusetts, which ordered an investigation into the society. Knox and his associates were accused of desecrating the spirit of American republicanism, the very spirit they had fought to preserve. By the time of the Society's first national meeting in Philadelphia in May 1784, even George Washington had turned definitively against the whole idea. Taking advice from Thomas Jefferson, who reported the unfavourable view of every congressman, or at least those who were not military men, who he basically didn't ask, Washington took action to heal the breach that the society had created. Using his position as president of the society, which he was elected to in absentia, he forced through changes in its constitution that eliminated the hereditary clause, placed its funds under the control of state legislatures, and abolished regular national meetings. As one attendee at the convention put it in his coded diary, he warmly and in plain language, or by implication, seemed desirous to expunge all the essentials with which the society was endowed by those from whom it had its origin. The Cincinnati men were not prepared to defy their beloved general by rejecting his proposals at the meeting, but that did not mean they were ready to accept the arguments that had been made against them. Over the next 3 years, debate within the society continued to explore the questions that had been raised about aristocracy, inheritance, status, and power. Just as they had been unwilling to relinquish their role as officers, many Cincinnati remained firmly committed to securing their status and that of their families as part of a national elite. Early on in the controversy, one Cincinnatus published a response to the pamphlet that first brought publicity to the society, that pamphlet written by a Charleston judge, Edinus Burke, and had been signed Cassius. Quote, "Cassius affects the phrase of a plain level state of civil equality," wrote the former cavalry officer Stephen Moylan, pointedly signing himself an obscure individual, and he was a Cincinnatus himself, Moylan. "I dare say that even Cassius will not contend that absolute perfect equality is possible to the government of any state. As the mind must govern the hands, so the man of intelligence must direct the man of labour." End quote. "Surely," Moylan observed, "distinctions, quote, have been made in all ages as rewards for services. They have seldom failed to benefit the country that bestowed them." End quote. "Indeed, social differentiation actually increased as society developed," argued Moylan. "A form of the division of labour, it was a sign of progress, not degeneration." Moylan's response to Burke, Edinus Burke, suggested a new attitude to class that called upon political economy and theories of rational progress. It asked American Republicans to recognise the benefits of being ruled. This contested class consciousness characterised the new nation's elite, taking different forms according to different regional contexts. In New England, struggles over status and social order revolved around the clerical and educational establishments. Unlike the Anglicans in Virginia, New England's Congregationalist ministers had sided early on with the Patriot cause, preventing their dissolution by the new regimes. But by the end of the war, establishment leaders, that is, church establishment leaders, faced challenges from several quarters, and they struggled to adopt political language that would help them maintain their status and power. Quote, "The late contest with Great Britain, glorious as it hath been for their country, hath been peculiarly unfortunate for the clergy," wrote one minister, Peter Thacker, in 1783. The problem, Thacker diagnosed, was that the Revolution's rhetoric of liberty had loosened the bonds of deference and distinction that tied New England's social order together. Quote, "The people, having emancipated themselves from the British government, have forgotten that they could never be emancipated from the bonds of justice." End quote. In sermon after sermon, clergymen and teachers in the New Republic especially in New England, urged that, quote, no state can long be happy unless government be reversed and the law obeyed. Government be revered and the law obeyed. Freudian slip. But like Stephen Moylan, they too began to frame their arguments in the language of collective interest. Quote, a wise and knowing people will think it no less their interest than their duty to support government and yield obedience to laws, claimed one minister. This makes it, another concluded, the interest of the people to obey. New England's establishment political thinkers made an implicit division between the people on one hand and government, that is, the establishment itself, on the other. One was meant to obey, the other to command. Membership in this ruling elite came less through inherited property rights than through often equally inherited access to elite education. Harvard University, protected and supported by John Adams' 1781 Massachusetts Constitution, was a gateway that divided the man of intelligence, to use Moylan's terms, from the man of labour. Yet in the wake of the revolution, this regional elite also faced fracture and internal dissent. New men, especially those who controlled growing commercial wealth, began to seek and wield power in ways that threatened the traditional establishment. Quote, you would be surprised to see the expensive living of too many, wrote Samuel Adams to a friend in 1785, the pride and vanity of dress which pervades through every class, confounding every distinction between the poor and the rich. End quote. The truth was the new men were rich. He wasn't really talking about distinctions between poor and rich. He was talking about distinction between old rich and new rich. They could afford the ostentation that offended Adams and threatened his status and sense of propriety. It was not that class distinctions in Massachusetts were disappearing, but that their nature was changing, and Samuel Adams was on the wrong side of that change. Such changes put pressure on the language of politics and justice, encouraging transformations in American political thought. One response to this pressure was the notion of natural aristocracy. Revolution and republicanism need not be understood as egalitarian, in the sense of the absolute perfect equality mocked by Stephen Moylan. Instead, it could replace unjust and irrational forms of distinction with reasonable and progressive ones. Instead of aristocrats born to rule regardless of their talents, it could empower aristocrats on the basis of innate qualities that set them apart by nature. This was an appealing idea to men who railed against the unnatural distinctions descended from the feudal past, but still deeply distrusted the power of popular majorities. Thomas Jefferson, for example, produced an education program that would select, quote, those persons whom nature hath endowed with genius and virtue, unquote, to be groomed for roles in government. His schools would make such chosen persons, quote, worthy to receive and able to guard the sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of their fellow citizens, turning them into useful instruments for the public. Likewise, John Adams held that general education was the foundation of public liberty, but that it could never exist, quote, in a simple democracy. Both men wished to create a ruling class in their own image, a fantasy that expressed just how anxious they were about the social order of the new republic. In fact, it was in Adams's Massachusetts and Jefferson's Virginia that local elites were strongest, and where revolutionary political institutions were among the least responsive to popular pressure. In those states, the horizontal threat of new men and a debasement of gentility by the power of commercial wealth seemed as important as threats from below. Elsewhere, though, in New York, the Carolinas, and especially in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, the 1780s saw dramatic confrontations that pitted new political majorities of lower-class white male voters against local elites. Leaders like William Findley in Pennsylvania and John Collins in Rhode Island helped develop compelling political programs that would redistribute wealth and influence from eastern and urban establishments to their rural and western constituents. They promised a windfall of the fruits of revolution for the white farming families who they believed had been the backbone of the Patriot cause. They demanded paper money issues that would improve currency circulation and inflate away private debt, delays and suspensions of tax collection that shifted the burdens of state debt from farmers onto creditors and merchants, and state-run land banks that would make mortgages and landed independence accessible to backcountry pioneers. Theirs was an egalitarian political economy for whites that threatened to use the power of the democratic state to dismantle the hierarchical social order. Local elites fought back against such popular movements in a series of confrontations through the 1780s. Each specific thrust from below produced a corresponding parry from above. But as the decade went on, elite rhetoric and strategy began to cohere into something larger and more systematic. Arguments and approaches that were tried in one state and one set of circumstances were adapted and improved for use in another. Language that worked was used again, while what did not was discarded. Just as they began to see the populist movements and their policies as part of a broader, somehow unified, levelling movement, a democratic mob that threatened both justice and the stability of the republic, a political representation of the lower sort across the entire nation, so American elites began to successfully construct themselves and their struggle on a national scale. Rather than through exclusive organisations like the Cincinnati, ruling class consciousness on a national scale emerged through the process of class struggle occurring on the state level. The culmination was the movement for the federal constitution, which would create the formal institutional structure to implement elite power in the political realm and crush the potential for democratic political economy that state revolutionary constitutions have created. But just what was the rhetoric? What were the strategies that characterized this emerging national elite class consciousness in the late 1780s? Crucially, they were not framed around the defence of aristocracy as such, be it natural or unnatural, nor did they foreground a notion of inequality or hierarchy, as these early 1780s examples I gave you did. They made no attempt to explicitly assert the superiority of a particular class or set of people. What they did instead was make a negative argument. They focused on expressing the grave danger that would result from democracy, from the tyrannical rule of the popular majoritarian will. The effect of this tyranny, first and foremost, would be to undermine property and ruin the credit of America. It would violate simultaneously the natural and universal rights for which the revolutionaries had fought, and the prosperity and development they should be able to expect in a republic free of Britain's yoke. Those rights could only be protected by the rule of law, a law that was inherently beyond the reach of democratic politics, that founded itself on reason and justice, on principles understood by learned scholars and practitioners, not voters and demagogues. Property, credit, and law, these were the conceptual tools with which the new national elite fought back against the onslaught of democracy. On the eve of the British evacuation from New York City in 1784, the Popular State Assembly voted to strip the rights of citizenship from any loyalists who remained in the city. Patriot voices outside the city vowed bloody revenge against those who had profited under British occupation. Yet the establishment of Republican authority in the city was also a moment when patriot elites worked to curtail that spirit of vengeance and set limits on the power of the democratic legislature. Among the leading figures in that movement was the lawyer and sometime Congressman Alexander Hamilton, who published 2 pamphlets in early 1784 that set out the case against the legislature in the name of law and universal principles of justice. The, quote, inflammatory and pernicious doctrines of the popular movement, Hamilton wrote, would lead to the subversion of all private security and genuine liberty. It was, quote, a dictate of natural justice and a fundamental principle of law and liberty, end quote, that no one could be punished or have his property interfered with without trial. Such principles were prior and superior to those of popular sovereignty and majority rule. The rights of republican government had to be, quote, modified and regulated by the principles of such a government. Among the extravagancies with which these times abound, wrote Hamilton, we hear it often said that the Constitution, being the creature of the people, their sense with respect to any measure, if it even stand in opposition to the Constitution, will sanctify it and make it right, end quote. Such a doctrine would convert the government into a government of will and not of laws. 3 years later, the same argument would be made in the fight over the Bank of North America in Philadelphia. Holding the bank as an instrument of oligarchic influence, controlled by the financier Robert Morris and his friends, the radical assemblies, elected in 1785 and 1786, pushed through an act to revoke the bank's charter, the cause of a great deal of panic amongst investors. One of the writers enlisted in the cause of saving the bank was an author who had worked for Robert Morris before, none other than Common Sense himself, Thomas Paine. Facing accusations of mercenary apostasy from his former radical allies, Paine wrote a lengthy pamphlet in which he upheld the distinction between, quote, being governed by mere will and power, end quote, and the rule of law. When government began to deviate from, quote, certain fundamental principles of right and justice, he wrote, there is a kind of stepping out of the republican principle and an approach towards the despotic one. James Wilson, a lawyer and land speculator, whom the bank had granted extensive credit, mounted a similar defence, and so did Pelatiah Webster, a Philadelphia merchant who had taken to writing on the principles of government throughout the decade. Relations between the bank and the legislature were determined by the, quote, rules of justice, of faith, and of honour, declared Wilson. In establishing the bank's charter, the legislature had bound itself forever hereafter, according to the rules and maxims by which compacts are governed. Indeed, in Webster's view, Pelletier Webster's view, it was the bank, controlled by its elite proprietors, that should create, quote, a check and restraint on government, not the other way round. Quote, the rich have an interest in their poor fellow citizens, and, as some men use their wives, however tyrannical they may be themselves, they will not suffer anybody else to tyrannize over them. End quote. The tyranny of law, equated by Webster with the rule of merchants, was the best way to resist the much worse tyranny of the democratic mob. If such a sentiment was destined to have little weight with radical assemblymen, it did help clarify the shared interest and strategy of the commercial elite, and not just in Philadelphia. What Webster called the, quote, sacred force of contracts had become, by early 1787, the rallying cry of a coalescing national ruling class. This hastening elite unity was dramatically propelled by events in New England that began in the fall of 1786. In Massachusetts, a series of protests and acts of resistance against the legal regime escalated from the closing of courts and freeing of prisoners by groups of rural farmers in the western counties of Berkshire and Hampshire to the organisation of an armed force of rebels that seemed to be within days of capturing the federal arsenal at Springfield. Observers like Henry Knox, now Secretary of War, founder of the Cincinnati, you may remember, quickly identified the rebels' grievances in class terms. The insurgents, he told George Washington, feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent, and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. In a word, they are determined to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws which are easily effected by the means of unfunded paper money. The current government, at both state and federal level, was too weak to secure the wealthy against organised class warfare. This dreadful situation, Knox concluded, has alarmed every man of principle and property in New England. Thanks in part to his own reports, it would soon alarm those to the southward as well. The idea that radical popular legislatures would use paper money to effect agrarian and levelling policies had not come out of nowhere. It had been a cause of political struggle up and down the states throughout the decade. But it reached its height in Rhode Island in 1786, when a new legislature brought about, quote, one of the greatest revolutions ever known in this state by introducing legal tender paper money with severe penalties for refusal. What resulted was a conflict between mercantile elites and the popular government, fought out both on the streets and in the law courts. In the most famous trial, Trevitt v. Whedon, Congressman and Cincinnatus Major General James Varnum convinced a panel of judges to overturn the new government's laws on the basis of legal principles more powerful than any democratic legislation. Quote, were there no bounds to limit and circumscribe the legislature, Varnum argued, echoing Hamilton, Paine, and others before him, were they to be actuated by their own will, independent of the fundamental rules of the community, the government would be a government of men and not of laws. End quote. Rhode Island's judges, he claimed, were, quote, bound by the laws of nature in preference to any human laws. Varnum temporarily triumphed, yet at the new election in April 1787, the radical legislators were again overwhelmingly victorious and paper money policies continued. Varnum himself turned his attention away from state politics and began to fix his eyes on the Convention of Notables to be held at Philadelphia that summer. If there could arise a new frame of government, assisted in its formation and principles by the wisdom of the Convention, it is very possible, said Varnum, that the majority of wealth, influence, and numbers will meet their sentiments. Others may not have banked on a majority in numbers, but they certainly understood the preponderance of wealth and influence had to be organised in order to turn back the tide of democracy and anarchy that seemed to be sweeping the new nation. The constitution that resulted was both a continuation of the legalistic strategy pursued by elites in the 1780s and a reversal of the earlier approach. It promised to create an altogether new authority in both the constitution itself and the federal government, to which appeal could be made over the heads of state legislatures. Rather than Coke, Blackstone, Grotius, and Vattel, the authority cited to curb the, quote, excess of democracy in local government would henceforth be none other than Gouverneur Morris's We, the People. But perhaps James Varnum had been right when he claimed that not just a majority of wealth and influence, but also of numbers would line up behind a new federal constitution. In terms of the actual ratification process, it has been difficult to determine with any certainty just where the balance of popular vote lay. Most historians agree that the process was characterised by highly manipulative practices on the part of the Constitution's Federalist backers. It was also severely skewed by the balance of regional representation, which gave too much weight to the older eastern and urban counties, too little to the newer western and rural ones. Even among those who could vote, probably a majority did not vote for the new constitution. In both Virginia and New York, a critical number of delegates ultimately sided against their own constituents' intentions. Nonetheless, the constitution did quickly achieve widespread support, even among those who had been anti-federalists. The tactics of its backers may have been suspect, but their ideology did have a much broader appeal than to elites alone. Alongside their negative arguments about the chaos and tyranny that would result from democratic power, unconstrained by deeper legal principles, the same spokesmen for the new national elite also projected visions of progress and prosperity. Upon the foundations of contract and fiscal reliability, expanding commerce and production would enrich all Americans together. James Wilson, for example, quoted Adam Smith in his defense of the Bank of North America. Quote, "The judicious operations of banking," Smith had written, "would both augment national capital and render a greater part of that capital active and productive, so as to increase the industry of the country. Banks created a sort of wagonway through the air that would free specie for investment. America would be like Scotland, whose improvement, wrote Wilson, was entirely owing to its banks." And Paine made the case explicit for his lower-class audience. The more money the merchant has, so much the better for the farmer, who has produce to sell, and the richer the farmer is, so much the better for the merchant when he comes to his store. In other words, commerce abetted by institutions like banks and protected by law would break down the division of interest between classes by benefiting all. As Alexander Hamilton envisioned in his Federalist Papers, Americans under the new federal government could join in a unitary prosperity. Quote, "The assiduous merchant, the laborious husbandman, the active mechanic, and the industrious manufacturer, all orders of men," Hamilton wrote, "look forward with eager expectation and growing alacrity to this pleasing reward of their toils." The evolution of ruling class rhetoric and strategy in the 1780s, then, not only helped construct a national coalition that recognized a shared interest in resisting the rise and policies of state democracies, it also had important effects on the more general ideological and conceptual construction of class in the new republic. By coalescing around a language of universality, of natural and rational principles that could be theoretically applied impartially to every citizen, the Federalists' thinkers helped embed the notion of classlessness in the American constitutional project. Gordon Wood focused on how, in his 1969 book, Creation of the American Republic, focused on how the Federalists used the language of popular sovereignty to spread the new regime's claim of legitimacy throughout the whole people. But they also used the language of law to construct the people as a single entity, undivided by class or interest. This had not always been the intention. Elites early in the 1780s, as we have seen, tried a variety of approaches that began with attempts to build explicit and justifiable hierarchies, natural aristocracies. The language of liberal universalism was a strategy they began to agree upon only late in the process, when it looked like all was almost lost. Federalists did not shed their sense of elite status, and they did not avoid, as much as they tried, the label of aristocrats. What they did, though, was reconstruct American political discourse around a framework that had no role for class conflict, that assumed the universal principles of liberty and justice favoured everyone. In Britain, this was the language of bourgeois radicalism. That's how it seemed to Thomas Paine, which helps explain how he became a willing part of the elite project. But in America, it was not a language directed against oligarchs and aristocrats, monopolists and corrupt courtiers. Rather, it faced the other way, against egalitarian popular movements that threatened to turn Republican legislatures into the instruments of levelling democracy. That language was written into the foundations of the new republic in the federal constitution, so that even when the Federalist Party itself lost power at the end of the 18th century, its basic achievement remained in place. The possibility of a democratic power unencumbered by a liberal vision of property and contract law was precluded from the American political scene. There would still be some who understood themselves to be outside the embrace of this universalizing system. Of course, large numbers of native, black and female Americans were excluded, exploited, or ignored by it. Sometimes their words in the struggle could puncture the surface of the encompassing liberal imagination. But that imagination was capable of unifying most white men in a way that seemed shocking to European observers. Law was at the center of this classless identity. It was the universalism of law, its rational impartiality, that seemed to place white male Americans on an equal footing with each other, eliminating divisions of class and providing the foundations of a mutually enriching economic progress. The language of the law, observed Alexis de Tocqueville in 1835, thus becomes, in some measure, a vulgar tongue. The spirit of the law, which is produced in the schools and courts of justice, gradually penetrates beyond their walls into the bosom of society. Law and its language set the terms of American politics, and it helped to construct, or perhaps to dissolve, American conceptions of class. The irony is that this classless ideology of law emerged not from the rising power of American democracy, but in the struggle against the claims of democratic revolutionary movements in the 1780s. Its dominance in the history of American political thought is the legacy of elite victory, not defeat. Tocqueville himself understood its tendency. The authority granted to lawyers was, he wrote, the most powerful existing security against the excesses of democracy. 2 generations after Gouverneur Morris foretold the end of his own class, the aristocracy, Tocqueville discovered it had only relocated. If I were asked where I place the American aristocracy, he wrote, I should reply without hesitation that it occupies the judicial bench and the bar.